everybody. My name is Anusha Dandapani. I'm the Chief Data and Analytics Officer at United Nations International Computing Center, and I'm also an adjunct faculty at NYU SPS. Today's topic for discussion that I'm going to focus on is algorithms and data, how we can identify and rectify bias. Let's get started. Ethics in a universal perspective is about knowing the difference between what you have a right to do and what is right to do. This was said by US Supreme Court Justice Forrest River, and this particular statement is more relevant today, and especially for the topic of discussion that we are going to focus on. Why does ethics matter? Because it poses a threat to our citizens' right to privacy. Number two, it also is a risk because of the lack of transparency that it poses through the data. And number three, it also introduces bias and discrimination in our data and also algorithms that are going to be defined using the data. I want to bring to the point that there are many stages to ethics. Yes, definitely real world bias is always reflected in the data and the data bias that comes along with it. And it is also exposed to the algorithmic bias, and that gets acted upon by the business bias, and which impacts the real world bias. So it is a never ending loop of different stages in ethics, but AI ethics and how to manage bias in particular, there has been a lot of talks about bias in algorithms and how to recognize it and manage it. But the real world bias involves actual bias in the real world, or more accurately, what are the biases that people and systems impose on the relevant portion of the real world, right? See, bias in data involves whether the data accurately reflects the real world, yes or no. And number two, and if the data itself is reflective of the real world, it will also be reflective of the inherent bias in the real world. I think we all agree to that context. Even more so, it is important for us to pay attention to the ethical principles, especially with regards to the data and the design of AI applications. There are three ethical principles that we need to keep in mind. Is number one, always embed values in designing this AI-based applications, because values becomes one of the important aspect of ethics. Number two, always embed diversity, human in the loop or human into practice, to make sure there is ethical aspect being embedded in these AI-based applications. And number three, always have AI for good mindset when designing AI-based applications. These are the fundamental principles of ethics and in AI. Bias in data, it involves whether the data accurately reflects the real world, yes or no. However, if the data is reflective of the real world, it will also be reflective of the inherent biases that comes in the real world. See, the bias in the algorithm is a measure of how well the algorithm fits the data. See, understanding of how an algorithm works will not alone solve this problem, the broader problem of issue of discrimination that we are focused on in today's topic. It is also about the critical factor is actually the underlying data set. If the underlying data has historically been compromised for a certain gender, race, or a nationality, then the results could be biased against a certain cohort outside of those groups. So bias is a sort of a factor which will always be there when it comes to ethical AI applications design. So see, the machines, they don't learn. They only learn based on the biased data. And if the machines learn on a biased data, will always make biased decisions, right? So what I mean by that, see that the data that are currently available will almost certainly be skewed because of Number one, the incompleteness in the data. Number two, the inaccuracy in the existing data set. And number three, because the past decision-making aspect that is already embedded in your data, as a result, the biases in the existing data and the decision-making are likely to be perpetuated and even exacerbated by these automated systems that are going to make decisions for the human decision-making aspect. See, machine learning algorithms are meant to seek out bias to classify data. This is the fundamental principle of how the machine learning algorithms are trained. However, getting the algorithms bias right is the key to get the good results. What I mean by that, see, good in this case is not an ethical question, but a matter of accuracy between the underlying data and the results, that is the outcome of these AI based sort of decision making that comes about. See, gender bias is a very important topic for discussion, especially at this moment. The reason being, as AI based systems, they start to take on more complex and decision making jobs, the stakes will become higher. What I mean by that, that the gender identity aspects are actually hidden within the data. They matter more, even more than ever now. Number two, these invisible data identities needs to be protected and inferred accurately, because making sure that the model training data sets are less of a stereotype and making them more devoid of common forms of biases is not just an option, it is a pressing need. So how can we go about to balance and debias gender in your data? What I mean by that is I propose three specific approaches or steps that we can go about. Number one, what we call as gender swapping. This is meaning very pertinent to replacing gender leading words that can be specifically to pointing to a gender. Number two, remove gender characteristic pronouns that can again be a leading indicator to a gender. Number three is a very important sort of a step is substitute the names of individuals with placeholder values, something like NAME. So that way you're not including individuals' names in your training sample when you're training these machine learning algorithms. So what I propose is there are 4 steps that we can take to reduce gender data inequalities. Number one is creating awareness, and we will touch upon more about how to go about creating awareness. Number two is paying attention to these nuances around making sure the identities are captured, because certain social norms may not be relevant to all groups of individuals that the data represents. Number three, maintain high standards, because these standards needs to be different for different multiple social identities and to ensure that the diversity of the data is maintained. And number four, score unfairness. What I mean by that is introduce additional methods of scoring unfairness, thereby measuring, not just measuring, but also mitigating this unintended bias that might come about by these machine learning algorithms. There are 4 steps to go about. What does I mean by step one is include a combination of efforts in education by raising data awareness, by capturing better data. The key to all the gender inequalities issues that we observe in data, the first step, capture better data. That is the mantra in making sure that these inequalities don't show up. And also, not just capturing better data, if there are data sources and applications that are capturing high quality data, incentivize them. Make sure that there is a sort of pronoun incentivization that we will go about when it comes to data sources which are actually capturing high quality data. See, for example, if there is a data survey that's being done where certain social norms of a country when collecting a data is kind of data set can lead to women not being interviewed on financial indicators. What I mean by that is like, indicate financial indicators like household income needs, because if these questions are not being asked to the population subset, it needs to be filtered out, because this will unnecessarily bring about this bias. There is another example that I want to put forth is that if the data capture by itself is being aggregated based on a sex and age, it needs to be highlighted in the data preparation or in the model build, because introducing this level of transparency and awareness of your data not only helps the better build process for your model, it also kind of brings this awareness around what data is being used in the model building process. Step 2, consider capturing nuances around identities, like, based on not just the social identity, but also on location based data, because certain social norms are only relevant among certain group of individuals. What I mean by that is, because if we end up introducing vagueness, that kind of makes the data point less powerful. See, this additional information not only may lead to welfare gains as well as benefits, it also kind of benefits to the core gender data that is used in the machine learning algorithms. It will also allow these models to more accurately estimate the likelihood of an event under a certain different scenario. See, for example, again, going back to the social norms of a country collecting a data leading to women not being interviewed on financial indicators like household income, it needs to be pointed out. It needs to be filtered out for bias ahead of time. Step 3, what I propose is the standards needs to be different for multiple social identities and to ensure that the diversity of the data is maintained. For example, people who identify with multiple minority groups, such as racial minority, can easily be excluded and also be overlooked. In an example of where the data is being captured for a health-based research outcome, where if the represented sample of the women that are being introduced clearly ignored a racial minority or black women not being interviewed or being overlooked, can lead to unnecessary consequences which can come about not just by in the data capture, but also because of this not approaching the data capture with the standard. So if we bring a standard and a sort of a agreed approach of how this diversity of data needs to be maintained, it not only helps, but it also helps us maintain the factors that we might end up excluding or overlooked. Step 4, score unfairness. What I mean by that is, see, to solve for unfairness by collecting high quality data associated with sensitive groups, I'm proposing apply machine learning to spot these biases, right? Like, spot biases at the onset, introduce additional ways to penalize not just for the algorithm's misclassification or inaccuracy in scoring, instead of allowing of introduction of additional contributor score the unfairness. So this way, these data penalizations will not only help us to measure, it will also serve to both measure and mitigate this unintended bias that will come about in designing these machine learning algorithms using the biased data. How can we make AI more inclusive? To bring about this topic, see, developing data governance structures that monitor the ethical deployment of AI is very critical. Number 2, establishing an oversight process. What I mean by that is establishing an oversight process not just to test the training data and the outputs of algorithms. It is also about seeking reviews with the internal and the external parties who will be involved in not just designing these AI applications, who would potentially be using these designed AI applications based on the data that these machine learning algorithms are being trained on. Number 3, that leads into the number 3 is like focus on creating explainable AI algorithms. What I mean by that is By creating an explainable AI algorithm, we not only enhance the transparency aspect of artificial intelligence or machine learning, of course, I'm using those terms interchangeably, but it also creates this sort of a trust in algorithms and the decisions that these algorithms will eventually end up making for you, right? Number four, make it compulsory within your organization, especially for the data scientists and focused on data engineers and the users of your data, on the importance of ethics, especially when it comes to designing AI based applications, because you start at the onset. When designing these applications, you have to keep diversity in the mind. Get more women involved. The more you involve women in designing these AI applications, this gender parity or the gender inequality will not even be a case. I'm sure diversity in the design team will bring about the diversity in the ideas of how these AI based applications are designed. See, to improve fairness, the best way to go about is actually to not just the data analysis and the model creation analysis, it needs to go beyond simple averages. What I mean to say by that is that we need to focus on better data quality to make sure these inequalities are made so visible that we don't end up missing out on these inequalities. See, focus on the data that is used for designing and developing AI applications in your organization. What I mean by that, making sure you will have people who develop these AI algorithms gather data from diverse sources with an attention to gender. Also make sure that the gender attributes that needs to be considered in designing these AI based applications are represented in your data when you are designing AI based applications. See, policies and frameworks should be mandated to highlight gender equality. What I mean by that is always focus on developing policies and frameworks within your organization that not just gives you a prescription but also mandates gender equality as a necessity, not just in private sector, in both public and private sector, because this needs to be applicable across the board. Broad spectrum of industries need to adapt. And keep in mind, collect sex disintegrated data. What we mean by that, see, algorithms are only as good as the data we feed them. We need to close this gender gap, gender data gap, by making sure that the women are included in these algorithms, and it is the ownership is on us, and especially women who are focused on women in data and women in AI based initiatives. Another important step that we shouldn't ignore is the data processing, because data processing procedures must clearly be defined beforehand, and it should not be prone to gender issues. See, men and women data must always be represented side by side for comparisons, because it is proposed to have cross tabulation of the subclasses. It is essential to have that gender breakdown at the design stage of AI or ML based applications. The reason being because it is important to be aware that these tabulations can produce gender bias towards a dominating gender, which is male. So it kind of puts the spotlight of where the bias could already be sort of embedded in your data in the right way. To conclude, I would say, see, this is not a one and done approach. See, engage in this decision-making process that incorporates this value not only will lead to transformative innovation, it will also make sure that the right outcomes are designed for AI and also data-based outcomes. Yeah. And we should also focus on instilling strong ethical values, because these ethical values will help not just improving, but they will also help us avoid creating additional rules. See, AI machine learning algorithms, they provide us with unprecedented capability. They also kind of expose us to this unethical bias. And organizations like us and also the wider organizations who are the audience of this conference, we should actively look and for often hidden unethical biases in data. And we have to make sure that the unethical biases in these data is actually an accurate reflection of the real world, because it's going to help us make ethical business decisions, right? Like, if it is this is goes beyond, if you cannot explain why you got there, especially when it comes beyond, this is not beyond us thinking about whether are we focused on explainable AI. This is more about being focused to the true core of not just building explainable AI, building ethical AI. Thank you.